My talk tonight is entitled Distance, Attention, and Being, Thinking About Media. I will speak for about 45 minutes, which I think is about all the attention that I can reasonably expect. Afterwards, we'll have a short break and then some discussion in the room just next door, down the hall. I got into this little thought project, which I hope to unfold for you today, by asking this question. If love is attention, what does it mean that we are paying so much attention to our phones? I first became interested in the idea of attention through reading Simone Weil, in whose work the love is attention claim appears, and then secondarily through Mur-doch's adaptation of Weil's thinking. In then trying to think about what attention is, I came across the notion of distance, which seemed to pop up all over the place in relation to the idea of attention. It shows up even in the metaphor embedded in the word attention itself. So let's begin with distance. In my initial account of distance, I draw heavily on what Walter Benjamin says in his 1936 essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, about aura and about distance. He is, among other things, developing an account of the effects of photography and cinema, which he treats more or less as one thing. Also implied in his account are print and audio recording. The really famous notion in the essay is that of aura. He's thinking about artworks and what's lost when they're reproduced, made into photographic or cinematic images. What withers in the age of mechanical reproduction is the aura of the work of art, he says. Aura has to do with the history of the thing, its situation in time and space, its provenance. When the artwork is reproduced, when mass images are made, authenticity is lost. For Benjamin, authenticity is tied up with what he calls the historical testimony, all that is transmissible from its beginning. With the loss of aura, substantive duration ceases to matter, as Benjamin says. If the general effect of modern technology is to overcome time and space, the crucial loss with respect to the work of art, the man-made thing, is its temporal placement, its peculiar relation to time, and its own origins and its relation to what it's been through. With this loss of authenticity, the object also loses its authority. We could look for examples to make this less abstract. Any number of frequently imaged artworks could serve. Michelangelo's David, Da Vinci's Mona Lisa, Notre Dame Cathedral, the Eiffel Tower. What's the authority of any of these things when you're there with them? We can assume seeing them in person will convey something to you. But if you do go to see them, that experience is itself so informed by and deformed by their fame through reproduced images that there's a sense of disappointment. Their original authority would have relied upon an inhabited and dynamic historical continuity, which has been lost. Quoting, "The uniqueness of a work of art is inseparable from its being embedded in the fabric of tradition," Benjamin says. What their meaning is now is an open question. There's plenty of fuss about the Mona Lisa, but what does it really signify for most of us? Benjamin anticipates this. He says, by making many reproductions, the technique of reproduction substitutes a plurality of copies for a unique existence. At the same time, it allows, quoting, the reproduction to meet the beholder or listener in his own particular situation. All this together, quoting again, detaches the reproduced object from the domain of tradition and leads to a tremendous shattering of tradition. A few observations here. The Mona Lisa reproduced meets you in your own particular situation. This means that you are less obliged to meet it in its situation. That could include seeing it in person, which we've noted is an experience already colored by the many images you've seen, not to mention the huge ahistorical crowd surrounding it. You might even not bother to go if indeed you feel you already have a sense of what it is. Regardless, you are unlikely to meet it in its situation, partly because that situation has been lost for you, partly because its authority has been dissipated. The visit to the artwork itself becomes something like a tribute to the old authority, an affectionate and aspirational nostalgia for uniqueness. The artwork is mediated by the images you've seen, by the sense you already have of it. It has already been assimilated to you and will have limited power to arrest your attention and call you out of yourself. That ability or power would be its authority. A side observation. In our education here, we rely on such authority in the texts we read. At the same time, we rely on the medium of printing. You might think that the ubiquity of editions of Homer's Odyssey would diminish its authority for us, its ability to call us out. Yet in general, it retains its authority, even in translation. And this must be because texts have a different mode of being and different basis for authority than do paintings, sculptures, buildings, and so on. I said that we would begin with distance, and we've spoken instead of aura. I began with aura because so much of what Benjamin says about aura will apply interestingly to distance, and because these two are largely the same. As he puts it, the concept of aura, which was proposed above with reference to historical objects, may usefully be illustrated with reference to the aura of natural ones. So he's speaking no longer of the things we make, artworks, but now of natural things. We define the aura of the latter, of the natural object, as a unique phenomenon of a distance, however close it may be, says Benjamin. And now here's the pivotal description from Benjamin. If, while resting on a summer afternoon, you follow with your eyes a mountain range on the horizon, or a branch which casts its shadow over you, you experience the aura of those mountains, of that branch. The experience isn't quite the same as with the artwork. Authenticity, for example, is not in question, or not in the same way. Tradition and historical testimony are not important here. What remains important, as I interpret Benjamin, is the authority of the branch. Authority is a uniting factor in the work of art and the work of nature, the natural being. It's what the kestrel possesses in Iris Mur-doch's essay, which we read together a few weeks ago in our all-college seminar. She calls it beauty. Beauty and the authority of being are two descriptors for the same experiential domain. For those who did not read the Mur-doch essay, let me offer some quick background. She speaks about the experience of beauty as perhaps the most accessible and obvious way for us to undergo what she calls unselfing. Such unselfing, in her account, helps with goodness. We need to be drawn out of ourselves in order to be good. We need a change of consciousness. Beauty, or what I've called the authority of being, can provide the occasion. And now I quote from Mur-doch. I am looking out of my window in an anxious and resentful state of mind, oblivious of my surroundings, brooding perhaps on some damage done to my prestige. Then suddenly I observe a hovering kestrel. In a moment, everything is altered. The brooding self with its hurt vanity has disappeared. There is nothing now but kestrel. And when I return to thinking of the other matter, it seems less important. This is a kind of practical Platonism. An encounter with beauty can bring us toward the good. It is also an instance of an encounter with a natural being, what Benjamin calls the unique phenomenon of a distance. Let's go back to the branch. There's something charming about the branch. The mountain is a more glamorous or conventional example, yet he mentions the branch, which casts its shadow over you, and not just the mountain. This shows that distance is a homely business. First of all, as he says, it's not simply a matter of remoteness in space. The branch might be materially quite close, yet it retains distance. Second, it's very ordinary, and it's merely the sort of thing continually burgeoning forth among natural beings. The authoritative thing is not far to seek. And yet, as homely as it has something in common with the work of art. This is its singularity, despite being like other branches, its unassimilable quality, its standing as a thing. Its aura is its unique phenomenon of a distance, as he said. What he would go on to say helps make this meaning more clear. He says that the decay of the aura has two social bases, two drivers in the societal sphere, namely, as he puts it, The desire of contemporary masses to bring things closer spatially and humanly, which is just as ardent as their bent toward overcoming the uniqueness of every reality by accepting its reproduction. Every day the urge grows stronger to get a hold of an object at very close range by way of its likeness, its reproduction. He's right to describe it as ardent. It has a strange eagerness as if motivated by some background love or ardor. I will try to later sketch out what this love is, which would assimilate to us all things. For now we can say that while the spatial distance of the branch or the mountain or the kestrel may vary, the reproduction is indeed held close to us. The reproduction overcomes distance, what you could call the metaphysical distance, and also overcomes the more literal distance. Both sorts of distance, metaphysical and material, are what a medium such as photography or cinema reduces, even to the point of abolishing it. Here I want to make a brief excursion toward Marshall McLuhan's assertions about media. He famously says, "The medium is the message." And that particular claim was so often repeated in McLuhan's day of fame that some of its force may have been lost on us now. What it amounts to is that the crucial thing communicated by a particular medium is its overall teaching or habituation, what it actually enforces or promotes through its use. As he puts it, the message of any medium or technology is the change of scale or pace or pattern that it introduces into human affairs. So these media of reproduction, photography and cinema to start with, and electronic media now, which subsumes photography and cinema, inasmuch as they bring things closer, have a message which stands over and is more consequential than the ostensible content or message of any one instance of media transmission. You can infer the message through the effects. The message is that everything can and should be brought closer, that uniqueness is to be overcome, that everything is to be held close. Another way to put this message is that everything can be assimilated to me and can be brought into accord with my own desires. This is a psychology and ethics and a vision of the human person, that the unregenerate, wishing portion is the true center of the self. It is the practical and effectual teaching of modern media. What was present already as a teaching to one degree or another in print, photography, cinema, and audio recording has been combined more powerfully in the medium of networked computers. As McLuhan says, each new medium incorporates the prior ones and makes them mere content. I'm just watching a movie on my phone, you might say, and such content of a medium, that is to say, the movie you might be watching on your phone, which is now, that medium has become the content. McLuhan says, that's like the juicy piece of meat carried by the burglar to distract the watchdog of the mind. In any case, the message of the internet and what it delivers, and which it delivers in a more trenchant, encompassing, and irresistible way than did any of its now swallowed up forerunners, is that it's all about you, and that everything can and should be called up to order in whatever way you wish. There's a prescient quote from Paul Valéry, which Benjamin includes. So Valéry says this, "Just as water, gas, and electricity are brought into our houses from far off to satisfy our needs in response to a minimal effort, so we shall be supplied with visual or auditory images which will appear and disappear at a simple movement of the hand, hardly more than a sign." Generative AI is the next medium in this succession. The distinction and independence of the thing not me continues to be under attack in more and more totalizing ways. We are at war with branches, mountains, kestrels, and with being itself. The costs of this for our ability to thrive, I mean to spell out more later. Let's return to the idea of metaphysical distance. Benjamin has broached it in relation to what we would call the things of nature. Mur-doch also starts here with her account of the kestrel. As she says, we take a self-forgetful pleasure in the sheer, alien, pointless independence of animals, birds, stones, and trees. The way that natural beings don't simply accede to our purposes, this really matters, and it's an aspect of their independent existence. For us, they are pointless in that they don't fit into our own selfish purposes, though they may well have a point of their own or a whole set of veiled purposes which are theirs and not ours. They have their own being, which stands in refreshing distinction and contrast to our own. As Mur-doch argues, we can be ethically invigorated through our apprehension of natural beings. And this comes from at least momentarily forgetting ourselves, our purposes, our wishes, and resentments. To forget oneself in this way is quite different, is at an opposite extreme from ordering up words, images, and experiences to suit our moods and wishes. In any case, Benjamin and Mur-doch both seem to be working out an understanding of distance, of the proper distinction between self and world, and the proper authority of beings. Without distance, world is not present. When distance is abolished, there is only the self. The tale of Narcissus may help to show an undistanced relation and why it's not enough for us. As Ovid tells the story, the beautiful youth Narcissus is plagued by reflection. First, the nymph Echo, in love with him but incapable of any utterance truly her own, gives him back only his own speech, and that in pieces. She is the ostensible other but reflects him to himself. She is not any way accessible to him as an independent being. She can reflect but cannot provide to him anything that he himself hasn't already given. She's only echoing him. Ultimately, she becomes a voice without a body. The lack of a body I take to be an emblem of her lack of being, or lack of availability as a being. For him, she is essentially a mirror. Now Narcissus encounters his own image in an exceptionally clear and mirror-like pool of water, and takes the image for real as he drops down for a drink, and I'm quoting from the account. While he drinks, he is seized by the vision of his reflected form. He loves a bodiless dream. He thinks that to be a body that is only a shadow. He is astonished by himself and hangs there motionless with a fixed expression like a statue carved from marble. Unknowingly, he desires himself. He will go on to become increasingly agitated at his inability to touch or embrace what he sees. It has no body, where again I take body to stand for being, for something with independent authority. What he sees lacks being. The representation cannot provide what he yearns for. What he yearns for is the real, is something actually present to him that is not himself. The water, as the perfect medium, gives him only a representation. And that representation ultimately is entirely assimilated to himself. There is no distance. In a final desperation, he wishes that the thing he sees were distant from him, while simultaneously wishing to forsake his own body. Quoting again, "My riches make me poor. Oh, I wish I could leave my own body. Strange prayer for a lover. I desire what I love to be distant from me." The image is too close, too much his own, too lacking in the fresh and vigorous difference of reality. So he ends in a repudiation of and alienation from his own being, through having been deprived of the experience of the being of another. He does not wish only to encounter himself. Now he expresses the desire to die along with his own reflection. As he speaks his final words, Echo repeats them. The motif of reflection and representation continues. When later a funeral for Narcissus is to be prepared, there is no body to be found. Here we take the body to mean the full presence of being or of a being. And indeed, being for the purposes of this lecture is what we encounter in ordinary life as branches, birds, and corporeal human persons. At the same time, we can see here some premonition of the modern escape from the literal fleshly body when one gazes fully and extendedly into the ultimate and perfect medium. In some extreme of the modern scenario, nothing is left but mediation. Echo and the mirror-like pool have no being of their own, and the being of Narcissus has collapsed through a kind of starvation. We can draw from this a notion I will present again later. Our own being, both its robust standing and our ability to affirm it and find it good, depends on and is nourished by the encounter with other beings. Maximally mediated visions will not do. Narcissus both dwindles and disavows himself on account of estrangement from the real. Being so beautiful, perhaps in his original condition instantiating a maximal authoritative reality, Narcissus powerfully draws others, but he is unable to apprehend others and is transfixed by a representation of himself. Any representation thus lacking in distance is so fitted to one's own desires as to amount to a self-portrait. Thus, a closed system, a feedback loop, is established which impoverishes the viewer. The apparent novelties offered by electronic media are conjured up to suit us. They thus lack the bracing quality of what might genuinely originate from outside the loop of mediated experience, such as the kestrel, apprehended with minimal mediation, or a human person, a true other encountered face to face. Levinas's idea of infinity in the face of the other helps us here. If you were wondering what's lost through the mediated image, we could say that it's every aspect of the human person which exceeds our capacity to have preordained it, to have worked out beforehand in some reductive account of the person. What can be rendered at a picture on my cell phone is by its nature already constrained to the representable. It must necessarily be a reduction. And further, the algorithmic selection of images and my own choice from among those offered by the algorithm is constrained by some set of predeterminations. It's what the machine thinks you like, or what you think you like. Meanwhile, the personhood of another exceeds all such notions. On what basis, you might ask? On what basis? I take the burning bush in the Exodus account as an emblem of personhood, chiefly divine personhood there, but by extension all personhood has such uncanny inexhaustibility and exceeds the comprehension. One can look at Augustine's account too in his Confessions to the effect that the human memory is inexpressibly vast and that the human soul is abysmal of unplumbable depths. But further, you might look to your own experience. Part of the difficulty of dealing with others is precisely the fact that they are wayward, unpredictable, unconformable to our concepts. Ordinary life shows over and over how unencompassed and uncontainable the other can be. And this is part of the impetus for taking refuge in the soothing experience of the phone. It's a balm for when you're tired from the burning incandescence of the human other. Boredom has something to do with this condition, the condition of being surfeited or frightened by being, and seeking as an alternative an undistanced and unchallenging relation. One takes refuge, but still craves the adventure not chosen. One notices the lack of liveliness and lack of surprise, but still avoids being. That's an unhappy condition, hence boredom. We can see that boredom may be more likely in a highly mediated age. One can easily turn away from being, and the habits thus formed make one more likely to do so. Such turning away from being has its reverse or opposite, the turning toward, and this is attention. Our English word attention enters the language through Chaucer, who carries it over from Latin. Attention goes all the way back to a Latin word meaning to stretch to or stretch toward. To attend is to stretch toward something, while attention is that act of attending or directional stretching. you can see that there's a spatial metaphor of distance in the word. The sunflower attends on the sun, stretching toward the sun. In order to stretch towards something, there has to be a distance to reach into, some distance across which some directional extension is possible. Benjamin's metaphor of distance, with reference to the authority of natural beings, now coincides with a metaphor of distance carried in the word attention. To turn your attention toward a being means there's enough distance for such a stretching to take place. If there were no distance, which is to say no independence belonging to the being, there would be no possibility of attention. To put it differently, if there is not difference between you and the being you behold, you cannot properly direct yourself to it. Narcissus, then, is not really attending to himself when he looks in the mirror like water. It seems a real question whether direct attention to the self is even possible, or more properly, whether a representation so close in, so assimilated, so much already one's own, can be an object of attention. We need some other name for what Narcissus is doing. We could say he's occupied with his image, not attending to it. Another question which arises here, if we dwell with the metaphorical possibilities, is what it means to be distracted. The first sense you might have, just noticing the latent metaphor in the word, is a kind of dragging to the side, a dragging away. That's the Latin meaning behind the word distract. So if you imagine attention as being a stretching toward across distance, distraction would be a dragging aside, a diverting of that attention. If now we examine the experience of distraction, I think we'll see that it's not usually a matter of shifting from one being to another. If you're paying attention, let's say to your child, and you are then distracted, it's unlikely that it's another being distracting you with its own vivid presence. It's more likely some representation that distracts you. You are shifting from a distanced relation to a relatively undistanced one. Inasmuch as distance has been lost, you are not attentive, you are merely occupied. The experience your cell phone offers is not an apprehension of being, but the rendering of images suitable to you. The loss of distance in such an example means that here the metaphorical background of the word distraction is somewhat misleading. Your attention has neither been dragged aside nor shifted the way a plant's tendril might move toward a new source of light, but has rather collapsed on account of complete proximity. There's no room for the tendril of attention. Let's sum up what we have so far with regard to attention and carry it a little further. Attention is attention across distance, toward the being of another, toward something not me, and not toward a representation generated for my gratification, nor toward myself. Without such distance of difference, there can be no stretching toward, hence no attention, nor can there be the nourishment, the ratification of my own being, which I would receive through apprehending the being of another. Narcissus abolishes himself on account of being so deprived. He gets plenty of attention but cannot give any, and this saps him of being. And without distance, there cannot be the possibility of surprise, of challenge, or of resistance, all hallmarks of an encounter with the real. It is precisely this resistance, the assertiveness of the real, which might strengthen us, make us more able to affirm our own being, both through our having been challenged and through our having encountered models of sturdy presence. Deprived of such resistance and of models for emulation, our own being becomes insecure and anxious, even self-negating. Hence, continual lack of distance resembles, in its effects, what we call trauma. Frequent use of electronic media induces something like the condition of having been traumatized. And for those already traumatized, electronic media may compound the condition. I want to state the primary claim again because I think it's likely quite urgent. Excessive mediation resembles trauma in its effects. My recapitulation so far emphasizes the good effects of having access to beings, minimally mediated. The ability to attend across distance to the real helps us avoid the fate of Narcissus. But there is also the virtue of attention for the sake of the other. This is the ethical aspect which Mur-doch seems to have in mind in her account of the kestrel. Self-forgetting helps us be less petty, less irritable, and opens us up to the world of beings so that we might be good to them. Through really attending to a present human predicament, one might discern the right way to proceed, and somehow, apart from any rule-based ethics, mere attention to beings might show you what to do. A being's own nature shall instruct you, shall show you what it needs. Are you unsure how to do right by your friend? Pay attention to your friend, to start with. I want to interject here a brief note on receiving attention. To receive little attention or unreliable attention or demented attention is the other side of the Narcissus story. This is trauma in its more commonly understood aspect, that a parent, for example, incapacitated in the manner of Narcissus might be unable to attend to you, unable to fulfill a primary ethical obligation. One could tell a story of attention in childhood, a developmental account. This story would have to include, on the one hand, the encounter of the child with the steadiness of being through the parents, and a world of other natural beings and of works of art, and then, on the other hand, would include the steady, loving attention paid to the child. Electronic media can interpose in both directions. The device can stand in, poorly, for the parent, becoming a surrogate parent, or the device can occupy the parent at the expense of the child. This might be another way to speak about the connection of electronic media with trauma, or at least with insecurity, anxiety, and a sense of unreality in the self. Simone, to whom Mur-doch owes a great deal, gives us a more directly religious sense of the ethical meaning of attention. Quoting, "The love of our neighbor, in all its fullness, simply means being able to say to him, 'What are you going through?' It is a recognition that the sufferer exists, not only as a unit in a collection or a specimen from the social category labeled unfortunate, but as a man exactly like us, who was one day stamped with a special mark by affliction. For this reason it is enough, but it is indispensable, to know how to look at him in a certain way. This way of looking at him is first of all attentive." Here we see that recognizing the existence of the other is crucial. He cannot be seen as merely an instance of a category. This would amount to his already being encompassed in our thought or in some shared social currency of representation. One has to acknowledge the independent reality of the other before one can love, before one can attend. As Weil says, belief in the existence of other human beings as such is love. And she, like Benjamin, adopts a metaphor of distance when speaking of the separate dignity of those we love. She says, "To love purely is to consent to distance. It is to adore the distance between ourselves and those we love." Once you really believe that the other exists, once you consent to distance, you're able to attend to the other. All of this is very high-minded. It's easy to moralistically recommend contact with reality. Yet in actual practice, we're all to some degree averse to the real. As T.S. Eliot puts it, ventriloquizing in the voice of a bird, "Go, go, go," said the bird. "Humankind cannot bear very much reality." I'm not sure how to reconcile that with what the kestrel seems to say. This bird has a whole different story. One way to understand Eliot here is that our capacity is limited, even if our disposition is good. Weil, on the other hand, thinks the problem is dispositional. She says, "Something in our soul has a far more violent repugnance for true attention than the flesh has for bodily fatigue. This something is much more closely connected with evil than is the flesh. That is why every time we really concentrate our attention, we destroy the evil in ourselves." This would be her account of why we might turn away and not practice attention toward other beings, there is an evil principle at work. For her, the goal is ultimately attention toward God, and this attention is prayer, so it's a project with commanding importance, and she doesn't have much patience with failure. Mur-doch, though in a more atheistic frame, is insistent that our selfishness and our low-down desire to protect ourselves from pain through fantasy and delusion. So she too thinks there's a problem with our disposition. I think the problem is primarily just our plain old finitude, with only a tinge of selfishness. So I'm pretty sympathetic myself with our desire to get a break from time to time. Let's suppose we've always had some difficulty with reality for whatever reason. Most of the time, the burning bush is too much for us, infinity in the face of the other is too much, and all this has always been so. But let's add to this inborn avoidance some factors of recent origin. One factor is the shattering of tradition, which Benjamin mentions in connection with the loss of aura. Maybe tradition has had a buffering effect, making our encounters with other beings more varied, softened, or somewhat refracted. In traditional ways, decorum or protocol allow at least a ceremony of approach when encountering another being. Further, our being part of a coherent local community with established modes of understanding entails some collective adaptation to the difficulties of the real and some sharing of the shocks. With the loss of tradition and the loss of shared frameworks of meaning, our pre-existing and primeval skittishness, when it comes to reality, is amplified. Technology plays a large part in these amplifying changes, and technology also seems to offer some responsive relief. We've already seen that electronic media, though occupying us in ways that can feel relieving, will in general not help us feel better or do better. If we now point out its addictive element, the predicament seems even more severe. It is common to say, and surely true, that we are addicted to our phones. This is more than a mere desire to find from time to time some relief from the real. The device is by design actively cultivating and promoting our captivity, and also has immense commercial forces behind it, others making money by entrapping us. In this respect, the device is similar to any addictive substance which can command our physiology and which has a money-making project propelling its distribution. The addictive power is the same between old drugs and new devices in that the leverage shows up at a fundamental neurochemical level regardless. Your body-mind wants it. The question then becomes, given the grinding quality of contemporary experience, what non-addictive modes of relief are there? One response is to say, more variation in the kinds of beings we encounter and in the modes of encounter could be helpful. One might turn from an exhausting social experience to an extended and free apprehension of natural beings, go see the branches, the birds, the mountain. This would be a shift of attention rather than move from attention to merely being occupied. In addition, it would seem to be a change to a different mode of attending. We can imagine also modes proper to the activities of sewing a shirt, of playing an instrument, of fixing a fence, of going for a run, and of reading a book. Some rethinking of the place of technology is needed. This is difficult because our minds are already colonized by it, even formed by it. And as you will have inferred, our domination by technology is a self-reinforcing movement where the effects on community, on culture, and on the day-to-day feel of being human reinforce themselves continually and condition our choices with regard to our use of technology. Many of us begin from the condition of being lonely and anxious, a condition arguably worse now than it was for our ancestors, and we make our technological choices from that disadvantaged and hungry position. Meanwhile, the overall sense of inevitability which surrounds technology as a force is strong. Often the sense of inevitability is paired with an unreflective and unsupportable techno-optimism. We must engage in critique and do so in public. That is a task of ours. The practical side is harder, but as a clue to what practical measures could look like, I want to speak of Odysseus. He is eminently practical. The ship of Odysseus and his shipmates is being driven by the wind toward the Sirens. Each of us, were we to hear the sirens, would hear the song made especially for us, as if by algorithm. Odysseus will hear a song flattering to himself and exquisitely attractive to him. He will hear exactly what he most wants to hear. But his shipmates, his friends, lash him to the mast. Without his shipmates binding him to the mast of the ship, he would be destroyed through the power of the song. This is an image of how the moderating, stabilizing, and even limiting role of a community makes us less susceptible to the power of the sirens, the algorithmic voices which would transfix us and would lead us into greater and greater isolation. Most of us, I expect, know someone who has been driven mad by the internet. The unceasing song has drawn them into some idiosyncratic and isolated frame of mind. Paranoid, fearful, detached from the ways of knowing proper to embodied experience. In general, electronic media have led us to a crisis of practical epistemology, where the ways we might know together have been overcome by the ways we seem to know in our solitary chambers. Odysseus' story points to the way that a community of localized friendship might tether each of us and help us stay in touch with basic ways of knowing, grounded in and informed by encounters with reality. This can be very hard to accomplish since old school sociality is besieged in every way. We would need to look at many things, not just our use of cell phones, but our use of automobiles, a close cousin of electronic media. Automobiles have affected how our dwellings are designed, where they are placed, how we use our streets, how our cities are laid out. This is just one side, the aspect of physical infrastructure and its effects on our ability to be together. And we would need to look more radically at our ethos of social atomization and how we got here. It's worth putting forward some picture of what community might be for, as difficult as it may be to bring about. The Odysseus story shows such a picture. I began with the question of what it means, if attention is love, for us to pay so much attention to our phones. What I would conclude is that we are not paying attention to our phones. We're only being occupied by them. This is because there is not sufficient distance for attention. With distance, there is respect for the authority and stature of the thing that is not me. The most important among natural beings for our thriving is the human person. We shall need to pay attention to one another. Thank you.